Almost a year ago, I was sitting in my office. I was a Pro-Vice Chancellor at Arden University, and I'd come across some papers that I found deeply disturbing, one of which is the Deep Adaptation paper by Jem Bendel, who I know very well. And another paper was the Hothouse Earth paper, and for me, these were real game changers. And I remember taking them into our exec team meetings and putting them on the table in front of the VC and the DVC and saying, guys, you know, business as usual. We have to stop. You know, we cannot continue to push out courses for students and knowingly sell students curriculum that is fit for a future that they will not have, that they are not going to see. So for me, it was a matter of personal integrity to resign and to move over into activism. And so I speak with my activist hat on today. So I'm going to start by looking at the current situation as we understand it, and then try and provoke some thinking amongst you all as to, you know, just how sustainable that is, and hopefully persuade you that it's actually not sustainable at all. So FE and HE are arguably focused on the economy. They're focused on delivering and reinforcing the global economy, and they're predicated upon growth economics, which is a concept that I think we urgently need to challenge. But essentially, we have our students here who come into higher education, or FE. And FE, as you know, HE and FE are regulated by the Quality Assurance Agency and Office for Students. So they're the independent regulators. And the students' experience and what they study at university is heavily influenced by professional regulatory statutory bodies like the British Psychological Society, which I'm familiar with as a psychologist, by academics and by employers who, in a sense, are just a proxy for the economy. And there's been increasing emphasis on employability, on graduateness, and then a lot of the KPIs and measures of success for universities are heavily linked to the economy. So, for instance, the Delhi data talks about the graduate premium and how much students are earning. So qualifications then are what students then exit their educational experience with, and those qualifications are those that service the global economy. And within the university sector, as I'm very familiar with in the Open University, which I had many years' experience, and then other universities too, there's enormous pressure to cut what we call underperforming curriculum. And the performance of curriculum is assessed largely in terms of contribution or something akin to contribution. And so with any institution, there is a segment of popular courses and a long tail of less popular courses, and increasing pressure on institutions to just cut those courses that do not make money, regardless of whether those courses are actually yielding a good student experience, and regardless of whether those courses are actually good for the individual. So the measure of success is really, are they good for the economy, as opposed to are they good for the student? But what that means is that in cutting inefficient curriculum, what we're actually doing is cutting arms and legs. We're actually saying to our academic staff, we no longer need you. And for me, that's a very dysfunctional approach to education. Okay, so looking at the students then and their expectations in terms of what they're coming into HE and FE with, well, if we look at the most popular courses in terms of course searches, and this was some information I got just doing a bit of a Google search the other day. So the most searched for courses are things like physiotherapy, law, which has a high graduate premium, psychology, which is a kind of jack-of-all-trades subject. It's highly popular, highly generalisable, computer science, computer sports psychology, and so forth. And that kind of presents a picture to us of the kinds of things that students expect from their future. And I think the question for us is, well, are they realistic and valid expectations in view of, you know, what is increasingly being seen as a global climate emergency, which is a complete game changer? So these are the students' expectations and the context in which they are operating. But if we look at what's actually happening and what the future likely holds for us, considering climate breakdown and ecological collapse, and for me, I'm very keen to paint a realistic picture, which will also be a stark picture for you. So I'm not, this isn't a doom-laden conversation. This, for me, is a get real conversation, because there is no escaping the fact that we're in a situation where we haven't yet begun to, at scale, look at carbon capture And the current context globally is that CO2 emissions are rising. So it's about as bad as it could possibly be. In terms of what the future likely holds for us then, this is a slide that I took from a deck. I had a conversation with the European Commission recently, and I'm working with the Foresight Group. And we had a discussion around, realistically, what does the future look like? The key theme is that we'll be moving from a sort of an active sense of the future to a more passive sense, in which we are more passively engaging with the planet. So there will be implications in terms of water management. We'll move from active to more passive, heating and cooling, cooking and lighting, communications, food sourcing and governance. But the general thrust of all of this is that we have no choice in the matter, that we will have to consume less. And if we do not consume less, and if we do not make a transition to a more passive lifestyle, chances are we will see some form of societal collapse, which is very much the position of Jem Bendell. And others take a more extreme position and talk about mass human extinction, which is about as bad as it could possibly be. So the future then looks not particularly rosy in terms of what unavoidably must be done, because you can't negotiate with climate change, you can't negotiate with the laws of physics, the laws of nature. So a paper by Rockstrom and his colleagues shows that global net emissions should be zero by around 2050, and in Europe and the US, which are by far the largest emitters of CO2 emissions, then that should be by around 2040. And that should just be something that we just accept has to happen. It should be something that we just do, and we should not be in a position where we are arguing with governments and where we have these weasel words and governments doing some creative counting, like the Committee on Climate Change, doing some creative accounting on what the emissions and so forth actually are, and excluding things like shipping and aviation. So in terms of energy then, and the 4 points I make here stem from a paper I read on sustainability, which was commissioned by the United Nations. And it tells us essentially what the future is going to look like. And if we accept this, and my case is that unavoidably we absolutely have to accept this, the world in which our students will be inhabiting, the world that they will inherit, will be very, very different to the world in which we currently see, where, for example, I have to confess that I drove here from Cambridge. In the future world, I would not expect that to be the case. I would expect us to be working in much more concentrated, smarter cities and using public transport as opposed to private. So, in terms of energy, we are looking at a world in which we will massively reduce energy consumption. With transport, it will be a shift from public to private. And with food, we will not be looking at imports of mangoes, bananas and those sorts of things that we're sort of used to. We will be looking at growing our own food. And housing and buildings, well, if we shift away from concrete and steel, which give rise to huge amounts of CO2 emissions, towards wooden constructions, looking at those 4 principles there, it's actually really hard to see how we're going to transition to a world that looks like that. But that is the world that we have to transition to. So what does that actually mean? Well, business as usual can't continue. And I think fiddling around the edges with a little bit of sustainability and declaring climate emergency without actually enacting that in a manner that has integrity simply isn't on. So we need to be really clear about what a declaration of climate emergency actually means. And the source for that report there, and hopefully the slides will be made available to you later, is a Global Sustainable Development Report drafted by a group of independent scientists. So unsurprisingly then, given that CO2 emissions globally are rising and given the complete apathy on the part of the UK government, activists have been responding. So Extinction Rebellion, with whom I've been associated since October last year, have their 3 key demands, which is around tell the truth, which is around carbon zero by 2025, which is incredibly ambitious, but it's meant to be challenging, and then around the citizens' assemblies as well. That movement has been hugely successful. Some of you may be aware that we've released a book, This Is Not a Drill. I was a co-editor on that book. We have the Youth Strike for Climate, inspired by Greta Thunberg, and then people in the UK like Anna Taylor, who are similarly making key demands and are having great success with Europe in terms of getting commitments to spending to address climate change. We have the Sunrise Movement, Scientists Warning, which again I'm associated with. And we're seeing across the UK declarations of climate emergency, so from UK councils and then universities. So it started with Bristol, other universities are following suit. I understand that Manchester is similarly considering this, or perhaps has done so, but I think there's a little bit of controversy around that at the moment. And looking at effecting change, well, we have to effect change. One of the issues, and I speak as a parent, I have 4 children, and it actually, it kills me that my children will inherit a spent planet, because one of the things we have to get our heads around is that our rates of consumption just aren't sustainable. But what we're actually doing is consuming the future for our children and for everything else on the planet. And I say that not to scaremonger or not to exaggerate. I'm saying it because that's the way it is. Okay. So, in terms of the university context then, well, curriculum has to radically shift, and reform is simply not enough. So we can't just green the curriculum by talking a little bit about climate change in some courses. We have to completely overhaul the curriculum and think about what do we actually need, what will people, future citizens, actually need. And that might be things like courses in permaculture. It might be things like how to grow trees rapidly, where to plant trees. It might be that kind of thing. It might be things on carbon capture. But it certainly won't be things centering on growth economics, because growth economics is actually a key cause of the problem. The university sector can lead by virtue of being the intellectual home to key disciplines. And I think my message to academics is you have to get political. So I became political by exiting the university system. And I feel that I've been able to use my voice quite effectively. But within the university system, academics and academic-related staff and people, professionals like yourselves, you need to use your voices. You need to push back, because accepting the mantra from above isn't going to work. You have to push back. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and then I'm going to hand over to Maeve, who's going to talk a bit about some of the things that we can actually do. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't have slides because I'm terribly unorganised, but I have got a lot to say. There's some seats down, there's loads of seats if you guys want to sit down, up there. Troublemakers at the back. Yes, okay, so I'm Maeve. As Jim says, I was a graduate from Manchester University, and I am now the co-director of a campaign called Rethinking Economics. So we're not specifically looking at sustainability, but what we are trying to do is bring down the behemoth of this economics of growth and optimization and efficiency, which we think is causing a lot of the problems that Alison pointed out. So we're student-led, and our purpose is to build a diverse movement of people who can interrogate and challenge the teaching and practice of economics in order to build economic systems that serve people and planet, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's what we ended up with. So we're grassroots. We're about 70 groups in almost 30 different countries, all campaigning at their universities to reform the economics curricula in particular. So I'm just going to talk about specifically why we're focused on economics, and then I'm going to talk about some of the activities that the students are doing, and then ways in which you guys can support them. So I want to start with a point that doesn't get as much airtime as I think it should. I think this is really important, is that undergraduate economics really matters, and by extension, college education of economics, which feeds into undergraduate economics, really matters. And the reason being that most undergraduate economists do not go on to become economists. They go on to become politicians, business leaders, bankers, people who create regulation for universities, and importantly, they create our media. And they decide what... The economy isn't created by economists, it's created by people, right? And these people create what our economic common sense is. So they create what society at large thinks of economics. So it's not good enough to say, yeah, well, undergraduate economics, of course, isn't perfect, but when you do masters and PhD economics, you'll get it, it's amazing. Because undergraduate economics needs to be better than it is, because it creates what we all think of economics. And this economics common sense, which we call it, which is created by these graduated economics students, is what has allowed for the worst excesses. It's what has allowed for business as usual. So austerity, for example, most economists would say that's a terrible way, that's a terrible thing to do. But because of what we teach undergraduate economists, politicians were able to push this through because the idea of a small state and letting the market do what it does is popular, it's common, that's what people think good economics is. And that's because of what we teach undergraduate economists. It's also pushed through this idea that we can find market solutions to environmental problems. We know that for the past 30 years, we've been trying to create economic market-based solutions to the environmental breakdown, and it hasn't worked. And yet this is still what we're banging on about. And so this guy called Paul Samuelson, who's a very famous economist, he famously said, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws as long as I can write its economics textbooks." It's really important stuff. And that's not the end of the problem. This is the last bit about the problem, then I will talk about some solutions. It's not just about what students are learning, it's about who those students are, right? So a very astute economist at the University of Manchester that taught me once said, if you get a bunch of rich white dudes together in a room, what are they going to talk about? Things that matter to rich white dudes. So our dominant economic theory was written by rich white dudes for rich white dudes, and as a result, the discipline continually fails to attract anybody that isn't a rich white dude. And this means that those who create our economic system are overwhelmingly rich white dudes. And because of this, our economic system disproportionately negatively affects women, people of a lower socioeconomic background, and people of colour. And we can see this. We know that austerity policies affected women of colour more than any other section of society. We know that the effects of climate change fall hardest on the global south, while those in the global north, who created the problem, shut down our borders. Yeah, it's not surprising that those who suffer most through our economic system are those who have least influence over it. So that's a big problem too. And as Alison correctly pointed out, the power and influence of economics makes all of the disciplines subservient. So we can see this again repeatedly in the public sphere. Theresa May says, let's get to net carbon emissions by 2050. Philip Hammond says, yeah, but it costs too much. And it doesn't matter what other disciplines say. It doesn't matter that climate scientists say that this is essential for the existence of the human race, or biologists say that if we keep hacking away at biodiversity, we will no longer be able to sustain human life on this planet, let alone other life on this planet. Let alone the fact that philosophers talk about the moral outrage of the legacy that we are leaving to our children. What's important to Philip Hammond and to the British government is the effect that it's going to have on growth and business. So that's enough of the problems. Talk about some solutions. Or something that's inspiring. So, yeah, so I'm going to talk about my experience at Manchester. So I came to study in 2012, so not long after the economic crash. I came to study because I wanted to understand economics and how all of this mess had happened. A friend of mine said, no, Maeve, don't study economics, you'll hate it. Do politics, philosophy and economics, that's far more interesting. Economics is very dry. I'm very grateful that they did that because I was loving my politics and my philosophy lectures, and the economics lectures were just deeply, deeply disappointing. So it was basically going through this like massively abstract theory, really complicated and convoluted and mathematical. Tutorials were copying problem sets off boards. Our exams were multiple choice exams, so there's no critical engagement with any of the stuff that we were learning. It was really unstimulating, but most importantly, it was completely disconnected from what we could see going on around us in the world. So I was a couple of months in, and I got an email in my inbox, in my student inbox, that said, calling all econoskeptics. And I love a pun. I mean, I was really angry with my economics course as well, but I love a pun. So I went to this meeting, and it was two of my fellow students, Zach and Joe, who had reached out to other students to start looking at this problem of our economics curriculum and what it was teaching us. And there must have been about 4 students at that initial meeting, and we created the Post-Crash Economics Society. And that's still here at Manchester today, and it's one of our strongest and most active groups. And we set up a committee and we gave each other jobs and we started running lecture series, alternative lecture series. We started putting on awareness raising events. We started petitions. We started lobbying the department. And one of the biggest things that we did was that we wrote this report that looked at the curricula that they were teaching at Manchester and pointing out how it was failing on all of the things that Manchester University said it was attempting to do with its students. And I went to an event to watch this guy called Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England, and like put my hand up just as a little agro student and managed to get him to agree to write the foreword to this report. So we put out, it was great. We put out a press release to The Guardian and we got it in the national press, and on the day that we put this report out, within around 2 hours we had 10,000 people that downloaded this report, which was incredible. And it gave us the momentum to set up the staff team, to set up as a charity, and to mean that we could keep this going for years after we'd graduated. But the point really that I'm trying to make is that this is happening all over the place. Students are going to economics lectures and going, this is absolutely insane. Like Alison said, this does not suit the future this is not the world that I'm going to live in, nor is it the world that I want to live in. And they're getting together in groups, they're setting up committees, and they're doing loads of campaigning activities all over the world. And as I say, we've got almost 70 groups now in almost 30 countries and growing. So just a few things that the students are doing. So we run international campaigns, and everything that we do is from the students. So the students will come to us and say, this is something we want to do, and then the staff team will work to try and spread that out around the network and support them to do that. So they ran a campaign last year on International Women's Day, trying to draw attention to the lack of women in economics. And they did like creative campaignings at their university, they did stuff on social media, they set up lectures, they set up women's groups within their departments to try and bring this issue to the attention of the universities. We're currently working with another group of campaigns in Europe called the Change Finance Coalition to lobby the EU Parliament to first change the way they teach money and banking. And I won't bore you about how they teach money and banking, but if you're into it later, I'll chat to you about it. It's bonkers. But also to change how the EU funds universities, what the requirements are to create a good economics education. The curriculum review that we did at Manchester, that then turned into a book. We did 7 different Russell Group universities in the UK, and we turned that into a book called The Econocracy. And it was on the Financial Times bestsellers lists in The Guardian, Goodreads. It had a lot of success, and off the back of that we got a lot more students involved in the campaign for a start, but students started doing their own curriculum reviews at their universities, so that when they go to the departments, this isn't good enough, and they go, you're a PPE student, what do you know? They go, no, look, we've got this backlog of evidence to show that it's not only a problem at this university, it's systemic and it has to change. We do inclusive conferences, so nobody wants to campaign in isolation. You don't succeed by campaigning in isolation. You succeed by movement building, by being part of a lot of people that are doing this stuff. So they do conferences that talk about alternative economics, but also there's peer-to-peer training so that they can support each other to succeed on the ground better. So they succeed in their own universities better and as a collective better. They're not waiting for the curriculum to change, they're creating their own resources. So our groups in Germany have created this incredible website called Exploring Economics, where you can learn alternative economics through blogs and journals, but also like mass online courses. It's absolutely phenomenal. Get involved in that. And then on the diversity front, our groups in Africa and Latin America are really leading the drive on decolonising the curriculum, and specifically the economics curriculum. And then in the UK, we're piloting a scheme where our students will go into underprivileged schools, talk about economics in an accessible way, show people how it really relates to their lives, try and encourage underrepresented groups to go and study economics, join Rethinking Economics, change the curricula, become economics influencers, and change the world. It's in 3 easy steps. So the ways that you can help, so one of the main problems we face, specifically in the UK, is the short student life cycle. So if you're a member of staff at a university, being a constant person at that university and supporting the group is a really big thing that you can do. If you're at colleges, talking to your students about the problems of economics and just pinpoint not just to Rethinking Economics but to other groups at universities and saying these are things that you can do. You get interested college students, these are the groups that you can join when you get there, because it won't be what you want it to be when you get there, and you have the power to change it. Obviously easy things like supporting them with booking rooms, suggesting speakers, encouraging colleagues to attend events and discussion groups. specifically at university, if you can help students navigate the quagmire, which is like the internal workings of a university, that's incredibly helpful. Like the amount of passing the buck that happens, it's like, no, speak to the head of humanities. No, actually speak to the head of the economics department. No, speak to your lecturer. And you just get passed around. If you can help students with that, that's incredibly helpful. If there are already existing mechanisms to lobby, like, for example, student councils or student reps, then support them to do that. If not, help them create channels and help them to see who are the people that they need to be lobbying. But apart from all that, in my opinion, power structures are changing because they absolutely have to change because we're literally on the brink of like collapse and destruction. Young people can feel this. Like, there's obviously all the people in the room that can feel this, but I think a lot of the older generation, because it's not, they can rationally get it, but as young people, we feel it in our guts because it's our future that is not going to happen. It's our cities that aren't going to be able to, like, the flood walls are going to breach, our political systems aren't going to be able to deal with the mass migration, we're not going to have children because we don't want to bring them into this world. We feel it passionately in our stomachs. And so it's your jobs to think about everything you're doing and how it builds power, right? Young people are taking the power. The climate strikes, the school children climate strikes is the most blatant one of these. They're not sitting around and waiting for things to change. They're changing it themselves. They are taking their power. And I think in absolutely everything that we do, we need to be thinking, am I building power? If not, what could I be doing to build power more effectively? And it's not about changing what you're researching or changing your job or anything. It's about finding people in your immediate surroundings that are trying to create this change or creating that change yourself and just facilitating that change. Because young people aren't going to be able to do it on their own. Nobody's going to be able to do it on our own. It's all of our job to be part of this huge movement, this huge push for change, and to be constantly trying to build power wherever we can. And that's it.
Alison, could we put the mic back on? So I'm sure you can save the voice. Okay, hasn't that been fantastic, folks? And if that hasn't stimulated an enormous number of questions, oh, we're in trouble. So, can I just have a sense of who wants to get some questions? If you think you're going to ask a question, get a hand up so I can just take a feel. Okay, we've got quite a lot. And the first hand I saw go up was right up there at the back. Can you keep your hand up? The lady with the brown, yeah. May I wait for the mic?
Rachel Howell, University of Edinburgh. I don't think it's mic is working. It's showing green, but it's not working.
Shout.
Okay, so I'm Rachel Howell from the University of Edinburgh. I would like to hear some good news. So, Maeve, have you actually seen changes in the curriculum at either Manchester University or any other university?
Yes. At Manchester's, yes, we have. There's a course. Actually, there was a course I taught on this year about economics and powers, which is an econ course, which is just an incredible thing to have come back to university to teach on a course that would be a course that we would have lobbied for when I was there. There's been a huge amount of changes across the UK in particular. Some universities have completely transformed their economics curricula, like Greenwich University. There's a course at Goldsmiths University, which is really pluralist and inclusive. Cambridge University have made quite a lot of changes. Manchester are now teaching this thing called the core curriculum, which it's not exactly what we would have wanted. I think there's problems that we have with it, but it's just a far cry from what we learned, and a lot more hands-on, and the pedagogy, it's really hard to say that word, is a lot better. But I think we are a campaign for curriculum reform, but our main aim is to create this movement of people, right? So what we have been incredibly successful at is finding young people, finding leaders, and giving them the tools that they need and the understanding that they need to become economic influencers when they graduate. And all of the campaigning stuff that people do is super important, but what is more important than that is creating economists of the future that can create the systems that we want to see. And so that's what we focus all of our energy on. And we've got some amazing results from that as well. Like there's a group at it's the civil society of the Bank of England and the Government Economic Service called, again, confusingly, Exploring Economics. But they're Rethinking Economics graduates that have managed to lobby at the Government Economics Service and change the training for all government economists. When they come in, they get exposed to all of these different schools of thought. And sort of planting people that think differently in all of these institutions is another big part of our theory of change. So yes, universities have changed, but more importantly, the sort of culture and the thinking around economics is changing, and the people that do economics is changing.
Alison, anything to add to those comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing that, you know, the work you're doing in terms of, you know, bringing about change in economics, because economics is such a core discipline, and that's great. I think for me, having been in the sector longer, I'm sort of being a bit older, you know, it's been disheartening seeing the rate of change, which has been way too slow. And I think although you're absolutely right to focus on influences, I think there's so much inertia in the system that has to be challenged, and I think it's going to take more than just economics, the reform of economics, to bring about the real shift that we actually need to see.
Okay, thank you. Our next question up here.
Hello, Julian Greaves from Bath University. In short, bring it on. Great news. I feel like it's time for a controversial question in view of what you've been saying. We're all rightly supporting, in my view, the Sustainable Development Goals, but they are predicated on growth economics, if you like, because they are the Sustainable Development Goals. Do you have any thoughts about that and how we should be responding to that aspect of them in the university sector?
Okay, I'll start, and perhaps I'll be controversial in what I say. I actually don't buy into the UN Sustainable Development Goals at all, because I think they assume that technology is going to save us, and I don't believe that. So hence my strong, you know, hence the words I was saying about, you know, we have to reduce consumption. You know, it's just not an option. I think we have to reduce consumption, and I think this talk about somehow transitioning to a world where a few solar panels and a few green cars, electric cars, is going to make things better. Well, it won't. I don't believe it will. So I like the controversial question. I think my controversial answer is that technology is not, in my view, on the basis of what I've seen, the conversations I've had with the climate scientists, with people in Brussels, I don't think technology will save us. You know, I noticed, for example, that there's talk about Scotland perhaps moving towards a nuclear solution as a kind of, to get us to a point where we can shift to renewables. But all of this is predicated on, let's preserve the economy at all costs. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at things.
Yeah, I agree that there needs to be like a fundamental shift, and I agree that the SDGs were created in this sort of culture of growth and optimization. And I think ultimately, yeah, we need to throw them out and create a better system. But as a campaigner and as a pragmatist, they're a good hook at the minute. So they're widely respected, universities sign up to them, you can use them to get in through the back door and say, well, yeah, you've agreed to this, and actually the way that you're teaching this subject or that subject is not in line with that. And I think that in the short term, use them as a tactic, but yeah, in the long term, well, we haven't got much longer, so in the slightly longer term, yeah, we will need to get rid of them.
Got a question from the middle here? We have the microphone down here, and then we'll go over there, and then I'll look for a question over here. So the lady at the back will be third question.
Thanks very much, Dave Gorman from Edinburgh University. So I welcome the passion and the diagnosis of the problem, but I want to be more specific about the solutions. So I'm not completely sure what you mean by throwing away the system. For example, so are you envisaging a fully communist system? Are you envisaging a form of market socialism? Are you envisaging a kind of Rawlsian property-owning democracy? For me, specific aspects of the economic system are the problem of aggregating land into the input function for the way in which we determine the production, or the privatization of money supply creation. So I welcome the passion, but I don't like conversations particularly that are too vague about the actual. So I'm really interested from Maeve in particular, what particular aspects of the economic curriculum as being taught. I get the sort of diversity point, but putting that aside, is it the design of the money supply? Is it the way in which we control and manage ownership of capital? Is it the distributive function? Or you know what I mean? The sort of specifics. I'd really be interested to hear more on that point. Thanks.
Yeah, so I can talk to you afterwards about specifics because it's very dry. But so I didn't say it because I only had 10 minutes, and it doesn't mean a lot of stuff to a lot of people. But basically, we're a campaign for pluralist, critical and real-world economics. And what we mean by pluralist is that there are many different ways of looking at the economy. And currently, we're only taught one way of looking at the economy, and we're taught that as if it's science. And that is optimizing growth and efficiency. That's the sort of tenets of what it is. We, on purpose, don't give an alternative, like a complete alternative economics, because we believe that it's going to take more ways of looking at things than one. Communism is not the answer. Privatizing the money supply, I'm sure some people in our campaign will advocate that, but we don't, because the point is, Ha-Joon Chang, who's an amazing economist, talks about if you're given a hammer, everything that you look at is a nail, right? And that's what's happening with our economic system. What we need is a Swiss Army knife. Some solutions to some problems we currently don't have in our arsenal. And a really good example of this is the global financial crash. We've been trying to fix the global financial crash with the same policies that created the global financial crash, and it's not going to work. There are loads of different schools of economic thought that have answers to how we do this that we're just not listening to. When we think about the environment, I'm sure a lot of you have read or at least heard of Kate Raworth's donut economics. That's a completely different way of looking at the economy. It's not about optimization and growth. It's about embedding the economy in the environment and recognizing that any decisions we make in the economy are going to affect the environment, and any decisions we make about the environment are going to affect the economy. And that is really useful for some stuff. Maybe that way of looking at the economy isn't going to solve gender equality. Maybe we need feminist economics for that. Maybe the point is there's no one size fits all. We're not going to fix the economy with another way of looking at the economy. We're going to need lots of different things, and we need to be open-minded enough and pragmatic enough and self-aware enough of what the problems are to do that.
Yeah, we did have a discussion about justice in Brussels, and it was incredibly heated, with people challenging and pushing back, saying that if you tried to bring down the financial system, the banking system, that it would lead to outbreaks of war. And that's quite possible. That's quite possible. Looking at the Extinction Rebellion and its manifesto, so the point is not to prescribe solutions, because that's the work of the citizens' assemblies, that people come together and then talk about approaches to situations and think about the solutions. So it's very deliberately doesn't propose solutions. Something else that I'm doing is working on a transition lab, so www.transitionlab.earth if anyone wants to look it up. And I'm actually inviting people, scientists, academics, to come and join this lab, where we will be focused very much. It's not a think tank, it's a do tank. So if anyone wants to look that up, get in touch with me, you're more than welcome.
Our next question.
Hi there, Emma Fieldhouse, Director of Future We Want, and also currently Interim Head of Sustainability at the London School of Economics.
Oh, hi.
Uh-oh. I've got the microphone, sorry. Two things, just a kind of a technical thing, but it might be political. Where are the New Economics Foundation in all this, if they are at all? And what should I be saying to Dame Minouche Shafiq, the Director of LSE, on this? What's the one thing you would want me to say or ask her?
I think that the main thing that academics struggle with is the thing that I started at, is that undergraduate economics matters. All that universities are built to do is to create, in economics, is create master's students. So they're like, well, you've got to learn to walk before you can run. And the point is that they're not going to ever be running. They're going to be running the country. They're going to be running the global system. So it's not good enough, and academics are very lazy with first-year undergraduates in particular, because it's just like churning them out. They have a moral duty to do better at this, and I think just that point. I spoke to this guy who was high up at Harvard or something about this, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I never thought of that." And it's remarkable how little academics think of that. And so undergraduate economics really needs to change, not because you need to create better master's students and in the Econocracy, I'd encourage you to read it. The LSE is the worst for this type of economics. The worst with evidence, not just me spouting off. And I can't remember what the first question was. Oh yeah, the New Economics Foundation. So actually, when we did that report, I ended up taking a year out of university to set this up as a charity, and the New Economics Foundation let me I had a year in industry, and they said that I was an intern there. And one of my lecturers here was like, yeah, she's an intern there. They've been incredibly supportive from the start, and I used to work with Miata, who's their chief exec now, and she's everything. She's amazing.
Just a couple of things. Ecological economics, operating within planetary boundaries, regenerative as opposed to degenerative.
Liz Harris, Solent University. You may have noticed when you came in this morning the security presence on the front door, and that's because yesterday there were a very small group of students who had organised and were just protesting about divestment at Manchester and the fact that the university is not divested. They were stopped from coming into the university, and a number of other students have been challenged by those security guards, and it's created a really unpleasant and hostile kind of environment down in the main sort of conference area, which I hope is never repeated at another EAUC conference. Do you think that's acceptable? And a second part, how as an outraged environment officer should I be responding to that? Because I am so cross, and I think Manchester should be really ashamed of that.
I'll kick off. I think it's incredible. I think it's amazing. I think it's inspiring, and that we should be supporting students in raising their voices, be they children. I think it's, the children started, and it's the adults who are following. It should have been the other way round. So I think it's great that students are raising their voices. They should do that. They should be heard. They should be heard at all levels. It shouldn't simply be lip service or tokenism. As to what happens in the future, well, clearly they're upset because universities are not divesting. They're not divesting fast enough, and they've got a load of sort of dirty secrets that they're trying to keep hidden. And these need to be exposed. So, name them, shame them.
Yeah, I think, it's difficult for students on their own. I think that, we need to be linking students up with other organisations that are working on this stuff. So, what we find with economics students is that they're great at economics, and they've read all the pluralist books, and they can tell you about all these different theories, but they're not very good at campaigning. They've not had any experience campaigning. So what we try to do is give them the tools that they need to be able to campaign better. And I think that can be extended out massively. And because students, as soon as they sort of they've got all of the energy and all of the passion. And most, I don't know, as a campaigner, I'm exhausted and I have no energy. I've got a lot of passion, but I'm tired all the time. Students have so much energy, and I think it's all about, exactly what you say, exposing what people are doing, and then sort of working to amplify that, and to work with other organisations and other students to make it as loud as possible. And then, just continually putting pressure on, and every time you put pressure on, thinking, this action that I'm doing, as I say, this action that I'm doing, how is it building power, and how will I build on that power in the future? And then you're planning the next action already, which Extinction Rebellion is amazing at. Every action that they do, they build power, and then they do another action that builds power, and it gets to tipping point, and then, then they topple. It does actually happen in practice as well. It's not there's loads of examples of this working.
University of Manchester's decision to stop students and those supporting them who wanted to make very legitimate points. The EAUC have met with the students to discuss the issues, and it's your right to be angry. So, can I have a show of hands? I've lost count of who wanted to ask questions. Where are we?
This isn't a question, but there was loads of fantastic information that we'd all like to dig in afterwards, but you didn't have any slides. Will we be able to get that information from you?
Yes. What?
You mentioned papers and contacts and people and all that we'd all like to expand our understanding
I'll
of.
send a...
Thank you.
That will be in the session papers that will be circulated. Down here, and can I have some more hands so that I know where we're going? The next one will be the lady with the hand up. Keep your hands up so I can see where to go. All right, far away.
John Thorne, Glasgow School of Art. Loud as well, sorry. Just to agree with that point, I think it was pretty disgraceful what University of Manchester did. I'd love the EAUC to be more radical, and I think the next conference, instead of being called Influence, it should be called something like Get the Fuck On With It. I'd also like us to stop working with the likes of Unilever and Marks & Spencer's, who are causing heat death and climate catastrophe, and we do work with them. What would you like our next conference to focus on?
Well, good question. It's a free consultancy.
I mean, of course I'm going to say student activism. Yeah, I think, yeah, sort of co-creation, well, genuine consultation with students on what they want their curricula to look like. And I think, like, what you say about the reform, because we always talk about reform, and you're exactly right, reform is nowhere near enough. And we need to be completely changing how universities work. And I think, student activism and involving students in those conversations and taking the lead from students and what they want is, yeah, I'd do that.
I'd say, what's the university for? Because it's not for the economy, and it shouldn't be for the economy. So I think that needs to be front and centre.
Okay, next question.
Lexi Jones, Change Agents UK. So just thinking about economics, so the first thing that most economics students will learn is about supply and demand. So I think in terms of moving away from a growth economy, the thing we can all do as citizens and consumers is to reduce demand in the economy. And we can do that in a very sort of democratic way, and we have a voice to do that as consumers. So I'm thinking in terms of activism, what can we do to encourage that decrease in demand in the economy and shape it in that way?
So I'm a big. It's a lot harder than you think. I think that people think than to stop doing stuff, to stop consuming stuff. So, for example, meat eating, right? Like lots of people have transitioned to veganism or vegetarianism. But a lot of people, like, eating meat is like linked with their culture, with their identity, and what they do with their families and their loved ones. And it's not quite as easy as just going, right, you need to stop eating meat. So and this is a personal view, this is not like the view of Rethinking Economics, but I think that the best thing that individuals can do is, yes, take a look at what they are doing. And I think that like you can see by the rise of veganism how successful that has been an area. But you focusing your energy on firstly on politics and voting, but on trying to push for that systemic change. And I think it's a sort of curse of, again, this is my own personal view, of neoliberalism, that the individual is the centre of everything, and everything is the individual's fault, and everything is up to the individual. And I think there's a lot of like destructive psychology that comes with it, like feeling super guilty for like getting pissed and getting a fried chicken on the way home. Like it's yes, those changes do have to be made, but they have to be combined with the push for systemic change as well. So I think, yeah, encouraging people to like support organisations that are pushing for systemic change, or become activists themselves, or to use their vote for the Green Party. Like, again, we're non-party political. That's my view, not Rethinking Economics' view. But yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, because you've got. It's a mistake to put the onus entirely on the individual, because that simply isn't fair. You know, some people can make those changes and other people can't. So I think there's only so far you can go with letting individuals and encouraging them to make their own personal choices, and showing people the consequences of meat eating, for example, or changing your wardrobe every 6 months, which is just insane. But there has to be policy from up above. And it's a really, really difficult one, because when you're talking, as I do, about reducing rates of consumption, that equates to people losing their jobs effectively, and that will have a detrimental impact probably on the poorest people in the global south, and that's where it's going to be felt. And it's a horrifically complicated problem, and I don't pretend to have any answers to that. at all. I mean, Caroline Lucas, for example, has talked about rationing as a potential, as a potential way forward. We've talked about, reducing the working week from 5 days down to 1. I mean, these are just massive shifts. But in order to do that kind of shift, you need an enlightened government who's prepared to put in place the kind of safeguards and measures to look after people, and particularly the most vulnerable ones. And that's kind of where we're trying to put the pressure on to make sure that kind of thing happens, via citizens' assemblies and so forth.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Katie Smith from Newcastle University, and I'm not completely furious at University of Manchester simply because, sorry, this is a statement, not a question. Sorry, just because simply at the moment this is a ticketed event, so we all had our barcodes checked. But I'm not saying this is a ticketed event. It should always be. Maybe someone said, should we change EAUC conferences? So now that we know this kind of thing happens, protesters, should we change it? It should potentially not be a ticketed event, but at the moment, not letting someone into a ticketed event doesn't make me furious. But maybe we should rethink it. We don't just have to put a full stop there.
Thank you. Gentleman along the line probably had his hand up. Let's have a quick look. Any other questions? Because we're getting near time. We'll come here next.
Hi, I'm Alex Luchford from Edinburgh College Students Association. Edinburgh College students aren't activists, really. There's no culture of extracurricular activities or campaigning, really, because the vast majority of the students are from, quite disadvantaged backgrounds, and they see college as just, you turn up, you get your qualification, you move on. How can we as a student association kind of encourage that activism if we should be doing that? As I'm only a staff member, not an elected officer. So I'm a bit morally questioning whether I should be doing that, but...
Well, I'm a working class lass from the northeast of England, and one of the things that made me I left school at 16 and I came to university at 25, and I had this idea of what university would be, where everybody would be talking to each other, it'd be really open, everybody'd be really open-minded and listening, and we'd be coming up with brilliant things together. And what actually happened was I was one of the only women there in my economics seminars, and certainly the only woman with a regional accent. And I was and it angered me, in Manchester, and I was the token northerner. And I am northern in Manchester as well, and this is the south for me, but still. It made me really angry, and I think that I don't know. I think that there's an amazing charity in Manchester actually called Reclaim, which is working class kids taking, and they self-labelled working class kids. They were asked what would you would prefer to be known as, and that working class was the label that they identified with. I think there's a lot of elitism in our society, and in whatever discipline that you do, it can be pointed out to people from a working class background, and I don't know how. If it's explained to them and show that you don't have access to all of these things that all of these people, just by virtue of being born somewhere else or with more money, have, I don't think, if that doesn't make you angry, I don't know what will. So I think just, telling them how bad it is for them.
So I would suggest that you have a chat with Amy's staff. Amy's sitting at the front. Just put your hand up, because Amy has done exactly what you're looking for. Incentivised activism around particular environmental issues as an elected sustainability officer in the UWE Student Union. So have a chat over lunch. Okay, I hate to say it, but probably the last question.
Okay, Maeve, you touched on it, politics. Isn't politics absolutely critical for this? If we're going to get rapid change. And don't we need a more informed voter out there? I've stood as a Green Party candidate, and what really frightens me is just the sheer ignorance of people in terms of politics.
Yeah. Well, I think we need our education system is. I don't know how you have a functioning democracy without a functioning education system, and I think it's it's one of the biggest roadblocks that we face. I think that Extinction Rebellion, what they are doing to bring this to the public and to show in a really easy and accessible way what the problem is, I think that we need more activism like Extinction Rebellion and the school strike to really bring these problems to the fore. I think that's the only way we're going to get the mass public to engage.
Yeah, it's about awareness raising en masse. It's about everybody talking about climate change. And I think that's what Extinction Rebellion sort of largely achieved in some ways. But I think there's also something else as a sort of final comment I'd like to make, and that's sort of to stop thinking in terms of them and us, because we often think in terms of, you know, the fossil fuel companies are the bad guys, and the activists are trying to be the rescuers, and you're sort of trying to rescue planet Earth. And I call that ternary thinking. And I think to sort of point to somebody else as being, that, you know, to try and attribute blame elsewhere isn't actually working, because, you know, we're all part of it. We have to see ourselves as being part of what you call a unary. So we're all part of this. We're all in it together. And I think, so what I'm trying to advocate is sort of shift away from that sort of them and us, you know, locating the blame elsewhere, because, you know, in the ways in which we live, you know, we're all sort of accountable and responsible to some extent. And I think if we can kind of feel that, if we can sort of spread that sense around to you know, more broadly, then, you know, I think hopefully we'll get more people on board. So we're certainly getting more awareness around, you know, climate change, activism, you know, ecological collapse. We've got David Attenborough, thankfully, finally sort of coming off the fence and sort of starting to say things. But other people too, who don't normally consider themselves activists, are thinking, hey, you know, I can do this. I can go and block a bridge somewhere.
I like totally agree with that, and I think I know I identified as an activist, but I actually think the term activist is really unhelpful, because if there are people being activists, there are people who are not being activists, and I think exactly what you say, it is everybody's job to be doing what they can, and as with the us and them, like, I've met millions of economists, and not millions, I've met a lot of economists. I've met more economists than most people, and they're really good people that want economics education to be good, want economics to be the best that it can be. And it's not about demonising people and blaming them. It's about bringing people along and showing that a new way is possible.
Well, I'm very sorry that I've got to bring this session to a close, because we've had challenging, thought-provoking, quite intense session.